Well, thank you very much, Nick. I didn't think that when you and I next appeared on a stage together, we'd both be dressed like Madonna. But stranger things have happened. I mean, the headgear, not the rest. And it's a great pleasure to be here and in this great auditorium of thought, filled with an enormous amount of brain power, with a focus on the future of employment and skills across Europe and the links to the workplace. It's an area that IPPR has had a long-standing interest in, and I think it's particularly timely to talk about it now, not only because of what's happening in the labour markets of Europe and the world, but also because this year, 2014, is the 20th anniversary of a major event. 20 years ago, the world was a very different place, of course. Following a sharp recession, Britain and its economy was getting back on its feet. In America, the president was staking his reputation on healthcare reforms, and in Eastern Europe, the Russian army had marched home, never to trouble that part of the world again. It seems so far away today. But 20 years ago, it was also the date of something that was as influential, if not in this area, more influential than what we're talking about today, which is than any of those things, which is the OECD's Seminal jobs study. Back in 1994, this piece of work brought together, for the first time, precisely what had gone wrong with international labour markets and what worked to fix it. And in forensic detail, it showed how countries could get themselves and their populations back on track. And in Britain, our labour markets had ebbed and flowed over the post-war years, and it was an important marker. After the war, the tough work of reconstruction and the reopening of global trade and the baby boom had led to a long period of vital and vigorous growth. And until the mid-1960s, the state played an increasing role in the economy, particularly in the pursuit of full employment, which was a core tenet of Rab Butler's policies. But then things began to change, and these were the days of detailed central planning and state control of the commanding heights of the economy, and the government even tried to nationalise Tate and Lyle. And over time, that tight government grip began to strangle growth, and centralised micromanagement couldn't keep up with the real-world demands of business, and industries grew sluggish, and unemployment started to climb. And while the state was beginning to strangle the life out of the UK product market, we also tried to import a German model of the labour market where the government and employers and trade unions worked together to regulate working life. But it turns out that importing a country's social contract isn't the same thing as importing your favourite Scandinavian crime thriller. Some things don't translate in the same way. And as the OECD's jobs study pointed out, policies to achieve social objectives were extended with the unintended side effect of making markets, including, importantly, labour markets, more rigid. And when the economy was tied up in this centralised planning and restrictive labour laws, we ended up, of course, with the 3-day week and the winter of discontent, and famously reached a low when rubbish was piled on the streets and the dead were left unburied. And at that time, that was the time that Margaret Thatcher then arrived to change things once again. And by the time of the OECD report in 1994, it had become clear that an efficient labour market was vital both for a successful economy and for a fair society. And a labour market that caused unemployment in the name of social goals led only to the social ills that unemployment brings. And that central principle of the value and the social value of a flexible labour market has been broadly accepted here in the UK ever since. Working labour markets allow people to work and, importantly, to choose where to work. And what's interesting over the last 20 years is that countries that broadly followed the OECD job study have broadly successful jobs markets, while those that haven't don't. And the 1994 report gave Britain a pretty ringing endorsement. Our labour markets were flexible and they delivered prosperity and growth. And when countries around the world were struggling, the OECD tended to point to Britain as an example of how labour markets can work and work well. So if the job study was the big news of the 1990s, the next decade brought another piece of international research that was absolutely groundbreaking and called for more international soul-searching in PISA and later PIAC. And in these reports, OECD turned its attention to schools and skills. And we learned, with a bit of a shock, that our education system was a bit like the England cricket team. By international standards, average, very average, and behind the Netherlands. And far too many people were passing through the education system without picking up the essential skills they need to succeed. And more than a decade on, we showed little improvement. And while our competitors were racing ahead, our results stagnated. Just last year, OECD published PIAC, a groundbreaking study into adult skills. And crucially, PIAC measures the skill levels rather than the qualifications attained at different ages. And it showed that 16 to 24-year-olds in this country were amongst the least literate and numerate in the developed world. Out of 24 nations, the country which publishes more books than anyone but the US and China ranked 22nd for literacy. The country that produced Alan Turing and Peter Higgs was 21st for numeracy. And most shocking of all, ours was the only country in the world where young people perform no better than their grandparents who had finished formal education many decades before. The generation leaving school with gay marriage about to become law had no edge over the generation who left school when homosexuality was still illegal. And if we think of the social advance in that time compared to education going nowhere, and despite more and more qualifications being proffered, too many 18-year-olds in this country finished more than a decade of formal education unable to read, write, or add up properly. It's not just an economic drag anchor, it is a tragic waste of talent. And experimental data published recently on maths and English performance for 16 to 18-year-olds are, in a sense, more shocking still. Of all those who did not get a C at GCSE in maths and English, around a third of 16-year-olds in 2010, around a third, only 15% of them were entered for GCSE English and 16 were entered for maths, and just 7% passed. Yet a GCSE in maths and English is of inestimable value in the labour market, and for most students, it's the difference between getting a job and unemployment. In fact, as Andreas Schleicher has said, the best protection a young person can get against unemployment is a maths qualification. And it means young people leaving school without the sort of knowledge or qualifications which further study requires as well, which employers demand and which equip young people to get a good job, go to university, start an apprenticeship, and choose their own path in life and, frankly, be in control of their fate. And across society as a whole, it stunts people's careers and lives and puts a brake on social mobility and means employers can't find the calibre of workforce they need, holds back employment and holds back growth. Yet years of grade inflation had given opponents of education reform the perfect alibi that young people were the ones to suffer from this. So education reform is not easy, and it involves facing up to many vested interests, but it is vital, and I think that these statistics demonstrate it. It is vital for young people, and it is vital for employers to get the skills that they need. And that brings me to youth unemployment. Youth unemployment went up over the last decade in part as the education system failed young people. Education was divorced from the reality of real work, and one of the central goals of our reforms, as well as bringing rigour, is to bring together employment and education. So we're making education more rigorous and more responsive to employers' needs. So as well as the drive for more maths and English, this is behind our transformation of apprenticeships, where it's employers, not bureaucrats or intermediaries, who are deciding what every apprentice needs to learn. And we're also putting employment and education side by side through new degree-level apprenticeships, so you can now train in professional roles like the law or nursing or space engineering through an apprenticeship instead of going to university. And our reforms to classroom-based vocational qualifications are just as radical. Employers must now sign off vocational qualifications for young people, so we know the courses are valued and respected. These qualifications that are not endorsed by employers, which Alison Wolfe, in that fantastic report a couple of years ago, she damned them as having little or no labour market value, they're being removed from the league table. So we no longer recognise, for instance, in the adult space, pole fitness instruction, self-tanning, or balloon art as qualifications worth funding by the government, which is bad news for the people who organise Silvio Berlusconi's parties. More than 3,000 qualifications for 14 to 16-year-olds and more than 3,000 for 16 to 19-year-olds have already failed to make the grade. And it is proof that the system wasn't working for employers. And in fact, we devised a very simple piece of policy, which was that 5 employers had to write and publish a letter saying that the qualification was of value to them and would add to the likelihood of them employing an 18-year-old for it to count as a tech level. And when we introduced this, we expected it to be one of the important factors, but that was the fact that it was so difficult for awarding organisations to get 5 employers to sign off on a qualification showed how far we needed to come. And we've now got 142 such employer-supported tech levels, and today we are announcing a further 77 tech levels to add to those already approved, which have been brought to the table by employers needing vocational qualifications in their area. And we think that by putting employers in the driving seat for apprenticeships and for technical qualifications, we're helping bring to an end the outdated segregation between academic and vocational education. These employer-led qualifications are central to the drive to bridge that gap between education and employment. And our commitment to helping every learner progress doesn't end there. The new national curriculum expects more of young people. Exams are becoming more rigorous and more stretching. The new accountability regime, published last week, is getting rid of perverse distortions and instead, across a common academic core with a range of academic or vocational subjects, will reward achievement, progress, and crucially, destinations for every pupil. Not just exam results, but where the young people end up, whether it's in university or an apprenticeship or in a job. And to make sure that every young person masters the essentials, we're focusing on improving English and maths from the early years right through to 18, and I know that was a subject of discussion this morning. But there's a fault line when people leave education. We need to know we're doing everything we can to link the leap from education to employment. In other words, how do you help young people leaving school, college, or university get into a job, and not just any job, but the right job for them? The kind of job that will lead to a career. And we need to know how we can help young people to make the best of that entry into working life, whatever they do, and not miss the first step on the ladder. So once people leave school, we want the new norm to be for young people to choose either an apprenticeship and a university. The number of full 16 to 18-year-old apprenticeships high-quality apprenticeships lasting more than 12 months and involving a real employer more than doubled from 53,000 in 2010 to 110,000 in 2012-13. And for those who aren't yet ready for an apprenticeship, we've put in place new traineeships, giving work experience, extra English and maths, and the chance to learn essential skills and behaviour, crucially, which employers demand. We're raising the participation age to 18. We're driving the use of technology to push up standards and getting more employers involved in providing high-quality careers advice, encouraging schools to offer top-quality guidance, and inspiring young people, providing work experience and mentoring. And then in last month's budget, we announced extra funding for the apprenticeship grant for employers, again, pulling together employment and apprenticeships. So a lot of this is about support, but it's also about making sure that we make it easier for employers to take on young people. So removing national insurance contributions for those under the age of 21 from next year and making it easier to hire people with changes that were controversial at the time, including tackling pernicious claims at tribunals. And partly in result, youth unemployment has dropped at its fastest rate in over a decade, and the number of people NEET aged 16 to 18 is at its lowest on record. So progress is being made. The number of pupils taught in underperforming schools has fallen by 250,000 over the last 4 years. The proportion studying core academic subjects, including in the English baccalaureate, has risen by around 60%. And if the numbers hold steady, we're on track to deliver 2 million apprenticeships over the course of this Parliament. And as the OECD analysis, new OECD analysis, which is released at this minute whilst I'm on my feet, shows that additional, they've released new data in addition to the PISA report from 2012, showing that England's young people are significantly above the OECD average in problem solving. But what's interesting is that we're not at the top of the table yet, and many countries of the East are ahead of us. And this is interesting because some people say you can look to the East for rigor, but the problem is you get less problem solving and those softer skills. Actually, the PISA results being published today show that while we are pretty good at problem solving, the countries that are ahead of us are from East Asia, largely. And within these, so these are, it's an important point of strength, but something that we must do more on. So I want to scour the earth for answers, and I pay tribute to JPMorgan's investment of 250 million in looking for and working on the answers to this crucial link. And each of the game-changing OECD reports that I've talked about, the Jobs Study and then PISA and PIAC, held up a mirror to governments and economies and societies all over the globe. And the reforms they inspired have directly or indirectly changed lives. Another report into this link by the OECD was published in 2000, and it was based on research from the decade before. But this was a decade ago, before many offices had email as a matter of course, before most people had mobile phones, let alone smartphones. It was when Amazon was a river in Brazil and Angry Birds was a Jim Davidson sketch, not a best-selling app. And since the 90s, the world has changed. Young people face more competition. They have access to more opportunities than any other generation in history. But I think that the time has come again for a deep, fresh look at this hugely important issue. And so after these groundbreaking reports into jobs and then education, we now need the groundbreaking report into how to get from one to the other. There is an important EU angle here, but surely the EU's role is to publish information and to exchange ideas and practice rather than to try to direct and dictate what should happen. And I think that we need to look again at the best countries, not just in Europe, but in the world, and how they support their young people through the transition from education to work, and bring together work on labour markets, on education, and, crucially, this gap. So, let me be clear, I'm not calling for a one-size-fits-all template, but for high-quality global analysis. And here in the UK, we need a clear mind, not a false prospectus of a worn-out retread of so-called guarantees that guarantee nothing but extra expense for the taxpayer, but instead a practical, grounded answers based on responding to employers and putting power in their hands and driven by research. And that way, we can tackle the scourge of youth unemployment. And in doing so, give millions the chance to live, to earn, and to ensure economic security for their future. Thank you very much.